The sun was setting on the horizon of New York City, painting the sky in shades of orange that reflected off the hundreds of mirrored windows of the Empire Business Center. On the top floor, Victor Roberts observed the city through the enormous windows of his office, holding a glass of whiskey while contemplating the empire he had built over the last 15 years. "Mr. Roberts, the merger documents are ready for your signature," announced Sarah, his secretary, interrupting his thoughts. She hesitated for a moment before continuing. "And your son Michael is waiting in the reception area. It's the time you arranged to pick him up." Victor closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of a responsibility he had never wanted. Michael, his 6-year-old son, was the last reminder of Claire, his late wife. Since she had passed away 8 months ago, the boy's presence suffocated him, constantly reminding him of his own failures. "Tell Michael I'm coming down," he replied without turning, his voice carrying a tone of resignation that Sarah knew well. In the elevator, Victor adjusted his Italian tie and checked his reflection in the mirror. The image he saw was that of a successful man, impeccable suit, perfectly aligned hair, a posture that exuded power. But his eyes carried an emptiness that no professional achievement could fill. Michael was sitting on one of the sofas in the reception area, hugging his small toy keyboard, the last gift he had received from his mother. When he saw his father, his eyes lit up momentarily, but he soon noticed the distant expression he knew so well. "Dad!" he exclaimed, running towards him. Victor placed his hand on his son's shoulder, maintaining a safe distance. "Let's go, Michael. I have an important meeting later." In the car, as the driver navigated the busy streets of the city, Michael tried to show his father a new melody he had learned on his keyboard. "Dad, look what I managed to play. Aunt Regina said I have talent just like Mom." "Not now, Michael." Victor cut him off, without taking his eyes off his cell phone. "I need to resolve some work issues." The boy lowered his head, clutching the keyboard to his chest. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken words and gestures of affection never shown. At the Roberts mansion, Victor watched, his son playing alone in the garden through the window of his study. The words of his own father echoed in his mind. "Sentiment is weakness, Victor. Real men don't get attached to emotions." Years of rigid education devoid of affection had shaped his worldview, and now, faced with his own son, he felt completely lost. The decision began to form in his mind like an insidious shadow. He convinced himself that it would be better for everyone. Michael deserved a family that could truly love him, and he needed to free himself from that responsibility that suffocated him. That night, while Michael slept, Victor made some phone calls. His plan was set. He convinced himself that he was doing the right thing, even though his heart, the same one he had learned to ignore, silently protested. "Tomorrow," he whispered to himself, observing the illuminated city through his bedroom window. "Tomorrow, everything will be different." Little Michael slept peacefully in his room, hugging the toy keyboard, unaware that this would be his last night in the Roberts mansion. His dreams were populated by soft melodies and his mother's smile, while the cruel fate orchestrated by his own father awaited the dawn. The day dawned with a soft mist covering the New Jersey coast. Victor drove his imported car along the coastal road, with Michael still drowsy in the back seat. The boy had been awakened before sunrise, with the promise of a special outing with his father. "Where are we going, Dad?" Michael asked for the third time, clutching his inseparable toy keyboard. "It's a surprise," Victor replied, his controlled voice masking the storm of emotions consuming him. In the trunk of the car, a small backpack contained some changes of clothes and provisions, his last demonstration of paternal care. They arrived at a private marina, where a small boat was waiting for them. The place was deserted at that hour of the morning, exactly as Victor had planned. Michael, despite his sleepiness, seemed excited at the prospect of a boat ride. "Are we going fishing, Dad, like that day with Mum?" The mention of Claire made Victor hesitate for a moment. He remembered their last family outing, before the illness that took her. She had always known how to create special moments, how to show love naturally, something he had never learned. "We're going for a ride," he replied dryly, helping Michael onto the boat. As they sailed further from the coast, the mist began to dissipate. Michael, sitting in the bow, was softly playing his keyboard, creating a melody that seemed to dance with the sound of the waves. Victor observed his son trying to memorize every detail of that moment, even as his mind incessantly repeated that he was doing the right thing. "Michael, I'm going to check something in the engine. Stay here quietly." The boy nodded, concentrating on his music. Victor went to the back of the boat, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared the small inflatable dinghy he had hidden. With calculated movements, he transferred the backpack he had prepared to the dinghy. "Son, come here for a moment," he called, his voice betraying a slight tremor. Michael got up, still holding his keyboard, and walked to his father. Victor picked him up in his arms, something he rarely did, and carefully placed him in the dinghy. "Dad? What's happening?" Michael asked, starting to feel afraid. "This is for your own good," Victor murmured, more to himself than to his son. With a quick movement, he untied the ropes that held the dinghy to the boat. "Dad, Dad!" Michael shouted, panic taking over his voice as the dinghy began to drift away. Victor started the boat's engine and accelerated, leaving behind the small dinghy with his son. Michael's screams echoed over the waters, growing more and more distant, fainter and fainter, until they became just a whisper, lost in the wind. In the dinghy, Michael hugged his keyboard tightly, tears streaming down his face as he watched his father's boat disappear on the horizon. The vastness of the ocean around him seemed to swallow him, and for the first time in his short life, he felt completely alone. The hours dragged on endlessly. The sun rose in the sky, punishing the small castaway who alternated between crying and playing his keyboard, the sad melodies echoing over the waters like a call for help. In his childish mind, he tried to understand what he had done wrong to deserve such punishment. The gentle rocking of the waves cradled the dinghy in a soft and cruel dance. Michael hummed softly a song that his mother used to sing to him to sleep, seeking comfort in memories of the love he had once known. His small keyboard, Claire's last gift, had become his only companion in that blue immensity. As the day progressed, hunger and thirst began to manifest. With trembling hands, he opened the backpack his father had left, finding some water bottles and packets of crackers. Even in his final act of abandonment, Victor had not managed to be completely cruel. 3. Sun was setting when Michael spotted a boat in the distance. His heart raced, torn between the hope of rescue and the fear that it might be his father returning to fetch him. Gathering his last strength, he began to play his keyboard as loudly as he could, turning his music into a cry for help. Old Joe had been at sea for more than 30 years, and his experienced eyes had seen everything in the waters of the Atlantic coast. That afternoon, as he was collecting his fishing nets on the small boat, Hope, something caught his attention. A distant melody, almost supernatural, danced over the waves. "Did you hear that, Zach?" he asked his helper, who was adjusting the sails. "Sounds like music, Joe, but here in the middle of the sea?" Guided by the sound, they approached a small dinghy floating adrift. The old fisherman's heart almost stopped when he spotted the small huddled figure clinging to a toy keyboard. "Oh my God!" exclaimed Joe, quickly maneuvering the boat. "Zach, help me here! There's a child!" Michael, exhausted and frightened, could barely keep his eyes open when the two men hoisted him onto the fishing boat, his small keyboard still firmly gripped in his trembling hands. "It's okay, son. You're safe now," whispered Joe, rapping the boy in a rough blanket he kept in the cabin. "How did you end up here?" Between sobs and tremors, Michael tried to explain what had happened, his childish voice broken by emotion. "My dad. He said it was a surprise. Then he left me in the dinghy." Joe and Zach exchanged heavy looks. In all their years at sea, they had never witnessed something so cruel. "We need to take him to the police, Joe," Zach suggested. "No," replied the old fisherman thoughtfully. "I know a better place. Sister Catherine will know what to do." The Chachim. Hope sailed for another hour until it docked at the small port of a coastal village. Michael, now calmer, observed the colorful houses scattered along the hillside, so different from the big city where he had lived all his life. St. Cecilia's home was located on top of a verdant hill, an old mansion transformed into an orphanage by the Franciscan nuns. When Joe rang the bell, he was greeted by the welcoming smile of Sister Catherine, a lady with grey hair and kind eyes. "Joe, what a nice surprise!" Her expression changed when she noticed the child clinging to the fisherman's hand. "And who is this little angel?" As Joe recounted the rescue, Sister Catherine observed Michael with a mixture of compassion and concern. The boy, still hugging his keyboard, seemed lost in his own world of fear and confusion. "We'll take care of him," the nun affirmed with determination. "Saint Cecilia is the patron saint of musicians, you know. It's no coincidence that he ended up here with his keyboard." Michael was taken into the orphanage, where other children observed him with curiosity. The smell of homemade soup came from the kitchen, and the walls, decorated with colorful drawings, tried to give the environment a homely air. "Do you like music?" asked Sister Catherine, noticing how the boy refused to let go of the keyboard. Michael nodded, playing a few soft notes. "We have an old piano in the music room. No one has played it for years, but maybe you can bring it back to life." On that first night at the orphanage, lying in a simple but clean bed, Michael cried silently. The other children in the room pretended not to hear, respecting his pain. When sleep finally overcame him, he was still holding his keyboard, as if it were his only connection to the life he had left behind. Joe returned to the sea the next morning, carrying the weight of that story in his heart. He promised himself that he would visit the boy whenever possible, feeling somehow responsible for his fate. At St. Cecilia's home, Sister Catherine observed Michael through the window of her office. The boy was sitting alone in the garden, playing his keyboard while other children played around him. She knew that recovery would be a slow process, but there was something special about that child, an inner strength that manifested through music. "God writes straight with crooked lines," she murmured to herself as she wrote the report that would be sent to Child Protective Services. In her 4 decades dedicated to caring for abandoned children, she had never witnessed a story like that, and somehow she felt that this was just the beginning of an extraordinary journey. The months passed slowly at St. Cecilia's home. Michael, still reserved, began to create his own routine at the orphanage. Every morning after breakfast, he would go to the old music room, where the piano mentioned by Sister Catherine rested, covered by a thin layer of dust. "Do you want to learn to play for real?" asked Sister Catherine one morning, observing how the boy admired the instrument from afar, never daring to touch it. Michael looked up, surprised. His small toy keyboard, although still precious, already showed signs of time and constant use. "Do you know how to play?" he asked timidly. "No, but I know someone who can teach you," smiled the nun. "Professor Gabriel comes to give music lessons to the children every Thursday. He would be happy to have such an interested student." In the first class with Professor Gabriel, a gentleman with white hair and a gentle smile, Michael sat at the piano with reverence. His small hands trembled as he touched the first keys, producing hesitant notes. "Music," explained Gabriel, "is a language that speaks directly to the soul. When words fail, notes can express everything we feel." Gradually, Michael began to open up. His mornings were dedicated to regular classes with the other children, but his afternoons belonged to the piano. Professor Gabriel was amazed at how quickly the boy learned, as if the music was already inside him, just waiting to be released. "He has a rare gift," Gabriel commented to Sister Catherine after a particularly impressive lesson. "It's not just technique, it's something deeper. He can transform his pain into melody." On a rainy afternoon, while Michael was practicing on the piano, a new girl arrived at the orphanage. Anna was 7 years old and had frightened eyes, reminding Michael so much of himself when he had arrived. She stopped at the door of the music room, hypnotized by the melody he was playing. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Michael, normally shy with new faces, felt an immediate connection with Anna. Maybe it was the fear in her eyes, so familiar to him. Or maybe it was simply fate bringing 2 wounded souls together. "Do you want to learn?" he offered, surprising himself with the invitation. Anna sat beside him on the piano bench, and Michael began to teach the basic notes he had learned from Professor Gabriel. It was the first time since his arrival at the orphanage that he voluntarily shared his music with someone. Joe, fulfilling his promise, visited regularly. On one of these visits, he brought a surprise: old sheet music he had found in a second-hand bookstore in town. "The seller said they're classical music," explained the fisherman, handing the yellowed sheets to Michael. "I thought you might like them." The boy's eyes lit up at the sight of the sheet music. With Professor Gabriel's help, he began to decipher them, immersing himself in a new world of complex and exciting compositions. One night, after everyone had retired, Sister Catherine heard music coming from the piano room. She found Michael sitting at the instrument, silent tears running down his face as he played an original melody, different from anything he had learned before. "What's this music?" she asked softly, not wanting to startle him. "It's for my mum," he replied without stopping playing. "Sometimes when I play, I feel like she can hear me." The nun sat down silently, allowing the music to fill the environment. The melody carried a mixture of sadness and hope, as if each note were a word in a letter never sent. The next day, during breakfast, something extraordinary happened. Anna, who normally sat alone, joined Michael at his table. Other orphans, noticing the change in the behavior of the always solitary boy, began to approach as well. "Can you teach us to play?" asked Tyler, one of the older boys at the orphanage. Michael hesitated for a moment, looking at his precious toy keyboard, which he still carried everywhere. Then, for the first time in a long time, a small smile appeared on his lips. "I can try," he replied, surprising everyone with his willingness. Music, which had begun as his refuge, was transforming into a bridge to the world. Professor Gabriel proudly observed how his young student began to open up, using the universal language of melodies to heal not only his own wounds, but also to touch the lives of others who, like him, carried their own stories of loss and overcoming. It was a Saturday morning when the couple Bethany and Andrew Miller arrived at St. Cecilia's home. She, a literature professor at the Municipal Conservatory, and he, an engineer passionate about classical music, had heard about the orphanage through Professor Gabriel, who also taught at the conservatory. "You've arrived at a good time," commented Sister Catherine, guiding them down the hallway. "The children are in the garden enjoying the sun." As they approached the outdoor area, a soft melody floated in the air, coming from the music room. Bethany stopped, enchanted by the sound. "It's Bach," she whispered, recognizing the piece. "But who's playing?" Sister Catherine smiled, proud. "It's Michael. He has a special gift for music." The couple followed the sound to the door of the room, where they found Michael completely absorbed in his interpretation of the piece. His fingers, now more skillful after months of practice, glided over the keys with a surprising maturity for someone so young. When the music ended, Bethany couldn't hold back her tears. Michael, finally noticing the presence of the visitors, quickly grabbed his toy keyboard and made to leave the room. "Wait," Bethany called softly. "That interpretation was beautiful. Do you really like classical music?" Michael stopped, hesitant. "Professor Gabriel taught me. He says Bach tells stories without words." "And what stories do you tell when you play?" asked Andrew, approaching carefully. The boy looked at his toy keyboard, then at the piano, and finally at the couple. There was something different about them, a sensitivity that made him feel safe enough to share. "Sometimes I play about the sea," he replied, his voice low. "Other times, about longing." In the following weekends, Bethany and Andrew became frequent visitors to the orphanage. They brought new sheet music for Michael, shared stories about great composers, and most importantly, they listened. They listened to his music, his silences, and gradually, his words. On a particularly special afternoon, Bethany brought a gift, a book about Mozart's life. "Did you know he also started playing very young?" she commented, sitting next to Michael on the piano bench. "And like you, he could express deep emotions through music." Anna, who was now inseparable from Michael, observed these interactions with a mixture of joy and apprehension. During one of their practice sessions together, she finally expressed her fear. "You're going to leave, aren't you?" she asked. Her small hands paused over the piano keys. Michael felt his heart tighten. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "But even if I do, I'll keep teaching you, I promise," Meanwhile, in Sister Catherine's office, Bethany and Andrew discussed their feelings with the nun. "There's something special about him," said Bethany, emotional. "It's not just the musical talent. It's as if our hearts know he's the child we've always been waiting for." "Michael has been through a lot," explained Sister Catherine. "The abandonment left deep scars. He'll need time, patience, and a lot of love." "We have all the time in the world," assured Andrew, holding his wife's hand. The news of the possible adoption was received with mixed feelings at the orphanage. The other children, especially Anna, struggled with the idea of losing their friend and improvised music teacher. Professor Gabriel, although happy for the opportunity his student would have, felt a pang of sadness thinking about the lessons they would no longer share. One night, after a long day of visits and conversations, Michael sat at the piano. His hands found the keys, and for the first time since his arrival at the orphanage, he composed a piece that didn't speak of sadness. It was a melody that spoke of possibilities, of new beginnings, of hope. Joe, who was visiting that day, heard the new composition and smiled, recognizing the change in the boy he had rescued from the sea. "Music," said the old fisherman to Sister Catherine, "saved this boy, and now it seems he's found people who can help him continue his journey." At night, in his bed, Michael hugged his toy keyboard, his faithful companion in so many difficult moments. For the first time in a long time, his dreams were not about the sea that had separated him from his old life, but about a future that was beginning to take shape, note by note, in a new score. The Miller's house was a cozy two-story home in the Riverside neighborhood of Boston. The room prepared for Michael had a special surprise: a new digital piano positioned near the window that overlooked a small garden. Even so, in the first days after the move, the boy still clung to his old toy keyboard like an anchor in unknown waters. "You can play whenever you want," said Bethany, noticing how her adopted son anxiously looked at the instrument. "This is your space now." Adaptation was a delicate process. Michael sometimes woke up during the night, frightened, fearing he was adrift again. In these moments, Bethany and Andrew took turns in his room, offering the security of their presence until he fell back asleep. "Want to tell me a story through music?" Andrew would ask on these difficult nights, sitting next to the digital piano. Gradually, Michael began to express himself through new compositions. His melodies, previously laden mainly with melancholy, began to explore other feelings. It was as if each note was a word in a musical diary, telling his journey of healing. The conservatory where Bethany taught opened up a new world of possibilities. Michael was enrolled in formal piano, music theory, and composition classes. His teachers were impressed with his ability to absorb knowledge and his unique sensitivity in interpreting classical pieces. "He doesn't just play the notes," commented his piano teacher Marina during a meeting with Bethany. "He understands the emotion behind each composition. It's a rare gift." At home, Michael began to create a ritual. Every morning before going to school, he played a small piece on the digital piano. Bethany and Andrew noticed that the melody changed according to his mood. It was his way of communicating how he felt without needing to use words. Visits to St. Cecilia's home continued regularly. Michael made sure to keep his promise to Anna, dedicating part of his Sundays to continue teaching music to the other children. His own progress at the conservatory made him an even better teacher. "You're different," observed Anna during one of these lessons, now helping to teach the younger children herself. "Lighter." Michael smiled, something he now did more frequently. "Music, it helps carry the heavy things," he replied, guiding her hands over the keys of the orphanage's old piano. At home, Bethany and Andrew created what they called concert nights. Once a week after dinner, they gathered in the living room to listen to Michael play. Sometimes he interpreted classical pieces he had learned at the conservatory. Other times, he presented his own compositions. "This is new," he announced. On one of these nights, his hands positioned over the piano. "I called it Family." The melody that followed was complex and emotional, intertwining themes that represented each important person in his life. There were passages that reminded of the swaying of the sea, in homage to Joe, soft and gentle parts that made one think of Sister Catherine, joyful notes that recalled his lessons with Anna, and a central theme strong and welcoming that represented his new home with Bethany and Andrew. Professor Gabriel, who occasionally visited to follow the progress of his former student, was especially moved upon hearing the composition. "You've found your voice, Michael," he said, proud. "Music is no longer just your refuge, it's your way of embracing the world." One day, while organizing his sheet music, Michael found his old toy keyboard. He held it fondly, remembering how that simple object had been his salvation in the darkest moments. Instead of putting it away again, he decided to take it to the orphanage on his next visit. "I want you to have it," he said to Anna, handing over the keyboard. "It helped me a lot when I needed it. Now it can help you too." The gesture marked an important transition. Michael wasn't just giving away a prized possession. He was recognizing that he had found a new safe harbor, a place where he could grow and heal without fear of being abandoned again. At night, after a long practice session on the digital piano, Michael found Bethany and Andrew in the kitchen. Without words, he hugged them both, something he had never been able to do on his own initiative until then. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion, "for choosing me." "No, son," replied Bethany, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for allowing us to be part of your music." 10 years had passed since Michael found his home with the Millers. Now at 21, he was preparing for his first solo concert at Boston Symphony Hall. Backstage, as he adjusted his tuxedo tie, his hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation. "Nervous?" asked Bethany, entering the dressing room with a bouquet of flowers. Even after so many years, she still got emotional seeing her son about to take the stage. "A little," admitted Michael, smiling, "but it's different this time. This performance, it means so much more." The concert program included not only acclaimed classical works, but also Michael's original compositions. The main piece of the night would be Forgotten Castaway, a symphonic composition he had spent the last 2 years developing, transforming his personal story into a complex and emotional musical work. Among the special guests in the audience were Sister Catherine, now using a cane but still with the same affectionate gaze, and Joe, who had made sure to wear his best suit for the occasion. Anna, who had become a talented pianist under Michael's continued tutelage, was sitting next to them, holding the concert program with pride. "He made it," whispered Joe to Sister Catherine as the theater lights began to dim. "That scared boy has transformed into a true artist." The concert began with masterful interpretations of Bach and Chopin, but it was when Michael started Forgotten Castaway that the true magic happened. The piece began softly, like gentle waves, before growing in intensity. The melancholic chords evoked loneliness and abandonment, but gradually transformed into a melody of hope and redemption. In the front row, Andrew held Bethany's hand, both with tears in their eyes. They knew every note of that composition, had witnessed its birth during the long nights when Michael would lean over the piano, trying to translate his memories into music. The music press present at the event was especially impressed. "Michael Miller is not just an exceptional interpreter," one critic would write the next day. "He is a storyteller who uses the piano as his voice." After the concert, during the reception, Michael was approached by Richard Thompson, one of the most respected music producers in the country. "Your music has soul, young man," said Thompson, handing him his card. "I'd like to discuss the possibility of recording an album with your compositions." The success of the concert opened doors that Michael had never imagined. Invitations for performances in other cities began to arrive, along with proposals from record labels and even an offer to teach at the conservatory where he had begun his studies. Amidst all this excitement, Michael maintained his commitments to St. Cecilia's home. Once a week, without fail, he continued giving music lessons to the children at the orphanage. The old piano in the music room had been restored thanks to a donation he had made with the fee from his first concert. "You don't need to come every week anymore," said Anna during one of these lessons, now helping to teach the younger children herself. "You must be very busy with your career." "Yes, I do," Michael replied with conviction. "It was here that I discovered music could heal. Every child deserves that chance." At home, On the rare quiet nights between commitments and performances, Michael still maintained the custom of playing for his adoptive parents. On one of these occasions, after finishing a new composition, he shared an important decision. "I want to use my music to make a difference," he announced. "I'm thinking of creating a social project, offering music education to children in vulnerable situations." Bethany and Andrew exchanged proud looks. Their son had not only overcome his own trauma, but was transforming his experience into something that could help others. The project quickly began to take shape. Michael used his growing influence in the music world to garner support and resources. The first cultural center would be inaugurated near St. Cecilia's home, with plans for expansion to other regions. "Music is more than entertainment," he explained during an interview with a cultural magazine. "It's a universal language that can give voice to those who need to be heard." The growing fame, however, brought with it unexpected exposure. His story of overcoming began to circulate in the media, attracting attention from people from his past. One night, after a concert in Boston, his manager approached him with disturbing news. "Michael, there's someone who wants to talk to you," he said, hesitant. He says he's your biological father." Michael stared at the card on the piano, where the name Victor Roberts was printed in golden letters. His hands, normally so sure when touching the instrument's keys, trembled slightly. The manager had left hours ago, leaving him alone with that information that now weighed like lead in his chest. "Son?" Bethany's voice sounded soft from the studio door. She knew her son well enough to know when something deeply disturbed him. "He wants to see me," said Michael, without taking his eyes off the card. "After 15 years, he simply decides he wants to see me." Bethany approached cautiously, sitting next to him on the piano bench. The instrument, which had always been a refuge for Michael, seemed strangely silent that night. "What are you feeling?" she asked, resisting the urge to simply tell him what she thought he should do. Michael let out a bitter laugh. "It's funny. I spent years composing music about this moment. I imagined 1,000 times what I would say if I met him again. Now," his hands touched some dissonant notes, "now I don't know if I want to hear what he has to say." The news spread quickly among those closest to him. Anna was the first to appear at Michael's apartment the next day. "You owe him nothing," she declared, with the frankness that had always characterized their friendship. "Your music has already said everything that needed to be said." Professor Gabriel, upon learning of the situation, offered a different perspective during one of his regular visits. "Sometimes, Michael, the most destroyed people are those who need healing the most," he commented, gently fingering the piano. "Your music has that power. The question is, are you ready to use that gift on someone who hurt you so much?" The following days were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Michael cancelled some commitments, needing time to process everything. On his long walks through the city, long-suppressed memories came to the surface. The day of the boat trip, the fear, the loneliness, the toy keyboard that had become his only connection to the past. During one of these walks, his feet unconsciously led him to the marina where it all happened. The place had changed a lot in 15 years, but the smell of the sea and the sound of the waves remained the same. "I thought I'd find you here." Joe's voice surprised him. The old fisherman, although more wrinkled and grey, maintained the same shrewd look. "How did you know?" asked Michael, sitting next to him on one of the benches facing the sea. "Some stories need to be revisited before we can write their ending," replied Joe, with the simple wisdom that had always characterized him. At St. Cecilia's home during his weekly visit, Michael watched the children playing on the restored piano. A small girl, newly arrived at the orphanage, hesitantly touched the keys, reminding him of himself so many years ago. "You know what I've learned here?" said Sister Catherine, approaching quietly. "That forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past, it's about not letting it control your future." In his studio, late at night, Michael began to compose a new piece. Unlike Forgotten Castaway, which spoke of abandonment and overcoming, this new composition explored more complex themes: forgiveness, understanding, and the possibility of redemption. "It's different from anything you've ever composed," commented Andrew, who found him still at the piano the next morning. "More mature, perhaps." "I think I finally understood," replied Michael, stopping playing, All these years I used music to tell my story. Maybe now it's time to listen to his story. The decision wasn't easy, but Michael finally picked up the phone. With slightly trembling hands, he dialed the number on the card. The voice on the other end of the line, aged but unmistakable, made his heart tighten. "Hello," said Victor Roberts. Michael took a deep breath, his hands instinctively finding the piano keys. "This is Michael. I heard you want to see me." The silence that followed was filled only by the soft sound of a solitary piano note, echoing like an unanswered question in the night air. The restaurant chosen for the meeting was on the top floor of a historic building in downtown Boston. Michael arrived first, purposely. He needed those moments of solitude to organize his thoughts. Through the panoramic windows, the city stretched endlessly, reminding him of the ocean that had once separated him from everything he knew. Bethany and Andrew had offered to accompany him, but he had gently refused. "It's something I need to do alone," he had explained, although he had asked them to be on standby in case he needed them. When Victor Roberts entered the restaurant, time seemed to freeze. The 15 years had left visible marks, the grey hair, the deep lines on his face, the less imposing walk that Michael remembered. Still, something about him still emanated power, no longer the intimidating power of his childhood memories, but something more fragile, more human. "Michael," said Victor, his voice trembling slightly as he pronounced his son's name for the first time in so many years. Michael didn't stand up to greet him. He just indicated the chair across from him with a restrained gesture. The silence that followed was dense, loaded with unspoken words and long repressed questions. You've become an extraordinary musician," Victor finally broke the silence. "I've been following your career for some time." "For how long exactly?" asked Michael, his voice controlled but firm. "Since when did you become interested in what happened to the son you abandoned at sea?" Victor lowered his eyes to his hands, which trembled on the table. "I saw you on television a few months ago. When you played Forgotten Castaway, it was as if each note was an accusation, a reminder of what I did." "What did you expect?" Michael let out a bitter laugh. "That I would compose cheerful waltzes about being left adrift in a boat?" The waiter approached to take their orders, but Michael dismissed him with a gesture. Food was the last thing on his mind at that moment. "I didn't come here seeking your forgiveness," said Victor after another long silence. "I know I don't deserve it. I came because I needed you to know the truth about me, about that day, about everything." Michael felt his hands instinctively, searching for piano keys that weren't there. It was his defense mechanism, his way of processing intense emotions. "The truth," his voice came out louder than he intended. "The truth is that you abandoned me. You left me alone at sea. At 6 years old, what truth could justify that?" Victor took an envelope from his jacket pocket, his hands still trembling. "These are records from the psychiatric hospital where I was institutionalized for the last 5 years. After I saw your performance on TV, something broke inside me. Years of denial and guilt finally came to the surface." Michael looked at the envelope without touching it. Part of him wanted to tear those papers, to scream that nothing could explain or justify what he had suffered. But another part, the part that had learned to transform pain into music, was curious. "I was raised to be perfect," Victor continued, his voice choked. "My father, your grandfather, he didn't tolerate failures. Emotions were seen as weakness. When your mother passed away, I didn't know how to deal with the pain. With the love I felt for you, so much like her, it was as if every time I looked at you, I saw everything I was trying to repress." "So you decided to get rid of the problem," Michael interrupted, his voice trembling with contained emotion. "I was sick, Michael. It's not an excuse, it's a fact. Years of emotional repression, of untreated trauma. I lost touch with my own humanity. What I did to you was unforgivable, but I need you to know, it wasn't your fault. It was never your fault." Silent tears were running down Victor's face. Michael felt something strange in his chest. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the first chord of a new composition, one that spoke of understanding. "I have a performance next week," said Michael, surprising himself. "At Symphony Hall. I'm premiering a new composition about forgiveness and redemption." Victor looked at his son, his eyes shining with contained hope. "I'm not saying I forgive you," Michael continued. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to, but maybe we can start by trying to understand each other through music." When Michael left the restaurant that night, the city seemed different. The lights, the noise, even the air he breathed, everything carried a new quality. In his apartment, he sat at the piano and began to play. The melody that emerged no longer spoke only of abandonment and overcoming, but also of understanding, of cycles that need to be broken, of wounds that, though they may never fully heal, can at least begin to mend. Symphony Hall was packed on the night of the premiere of Michael's new composition. Among those present, familiar faces stood out. Bethany and Andrew in the front row, Joe and Sister Catherine right behind, Anna coordinating a group of children from the orphanage that Michael had insisted on inviting, and discreetly seated in the back, Victor Roberts. Backstage, Michael adjusted his bow tie while observing the movement through a gap in the curtain. The past few weeks had been intense, rehearsals, meetings, and long conversations with his therapist about the meaning of that night. "Are you ready?" asked Professor Gabriel, who would be conducting the orchestra for this special performance. Michael nodded, his hands instinctively running through an imaginary melody in the air. "It's more than a concert," he replied. "It's a new beginning." The new composition was called Reconciliation in B minor. Unlike his previous works, this had been written for piano and full orchestra, representing the multiple voices and experiences that had shaped his journey. When the curtains opened, Michael walked to the piano with a serenity that surprised all who knew him. Before beginning, he addressed the audience. "Tonight is not just about music," his voice echoed through the hall. "It's about transforming pain into hope, about breaking cycles of trauma, about finding light even in the darkest moments." The first chords filled the room. The composition began with a melancholic piano solo, reminiscent of Forgotten Castaway, but soon the orchestra joined in, bringing new colors and textures to the melody. One could hear echoes of the sea, moments of tension and fear, but also of hope and renewal. In the audience, Victor listened with his eyes closed, each note seeming to touch an old wound in his heart. When the music reached its climax, a subtle transformation occurred. The melody of abandonment and loneliness intertwined with themes of understanding and forgiveness, creating something entirely new and deeply moving. At the end of the performance, the entire hall rose in applause, but Michael had one more surprise. Taking the microphone again, he announced, "Today, we celebrate not just music. I'm pleased to announce the creation of the New Chords Foundation, a project aimed at bringing music education to children in vulnerable situations across America." The bigger surprise came when Victor stood up from his seat and walked to the stage. With a choked voice, he complimented the announcement. "As the main investor of the foundation, I'm donating the building of the former Roberts Enterprises headquarters to be the first cultural center of the project. It's a small part of what I owe not just to my son, but to all children who need a chance to be heard." The project had been discussed in secret in the weeks following the restaurant meeting. Victor, seeking a concrete way to demonstrate his remorse and desire for change, had proposed the donation. Michael, initially skeptical, realized they could transform a symbol of separation into an instrument of unity and healing. In the months that followed, the old corporate building transformed into a vibrant arts center. Rooms once occupied by executives now echoed with the sound of musical instruments. The auditorium where Victor used to hold business meetings became a concert hall for young talents. Anna took on the pedagogical coordination of the project, a job for which her personal experience had perfectly prepared her. Professor Gabriel supervised the teacher training program, ensuring that the quality of education reached the highest standards. On a particularly significant afternoon, Michael found Victor observing a piano class for beginners. A small girl, newly arrived at the program, was hesitantly playing the same keys that Michael used to play on his old toy keyboard. "She reminds me of you," Victor said softly. "She'll have a different destiny," Michael replied. "They all will." The relationship between father and son remained complex, marked by moments of tension and discomfort. But there were also moments of mutual understanding, small advances that, like notes in a score, began to form a new melody. In one of the rooms of the cultural center, Michael's old toy keyboard occupied a place of honor in a display case. Next to it, a plaque told its story, no longer just a story of abandonment, but of overcoming, transformation, and hope. "You know what I've learned," Michael said to a group of students during a masterclass, "that sometimes the most important notes in a piece of music are the silences. They're the ones that allow us to breathe, reflect, and move forward." The New Chords Foundation grew beyond initial expectations. Other cultural centers were opened in different cities, each adapted to local needs, but all maintaining the same essence, the transformative power of music. One night after a recital by the foundation's students, Bethany found Michael alone at the piano, playing softly. "What's that music?" she asked. "It doesn't have a name yet," he replied, smiling. "But I think it's about new beginnings." The soft melody floated through the empty auditorium, carrying in its notes the promise that even from the most painful stories, symphonies of hope and renewal can be born.